creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. It is our weekend edition, and we have lots to talk about. Fortunately, we have lots of commentators around the table to comment on that as well. Debbie Georgatos with us, as well as Dr. Merrill Matthews and Kelly Shackelford, just to mention a few. And we're going to be talking about just getting a few comments since, of course, we had the funeral and then the burial of George Herbert Walker Bush, some of the comments there. Since we're talking in the Texas Hour, we'll talk about something out of Austin. The Austin, Texas City Code would force churches to hire LGBT employees, and a couple of other issues. Then we're going to get into a couple of issues that we've talked about this week, but not really got into in depth. What's happening to those riots there in France? Dr. Merrill Matthews has a piece where the French tell President Macron where to stick his gas tax. That is actually the title of it. And then also one of his colleagues has been a part of the First Step Act. And then a little bit later, I thought we'd also get into the fact that the chairman of the Democratic National Committee is convinced that these pesky Christians are part of the problem with voting. So just have lots of things to talk about. Debbie Georgatos, any thoughts about the festivities, if you will, the celebration of the life of George Herbert Walker Bush? Any comments?
I'm always grateful to see America honor as someone who, certainly the military hero that he was. We were mentioning before we came on air that former President H.W. Bush left or decided not to go off to college at Yale, instead joined the American military and fought in World War II. He was a hero. He was brave. He fought, whatever it was, 53 missions or something, 58 missions. Very brave man. I appreciate his service. You know, over time in America, we look back at our presidents and the country shifting around, and he certainly was a Republican at the time who captured America's heart and did about the right thing. I think in today's world and the political divide we find ourselves in, he's seen as more of a moderate, and so there are some people who, you know, they appreciate his service, certainly militarily, even for the presidency, but they that think you can't have a president of his ilk in this time succeed. But I'm grateful for him and his wife loved him dearly. They had the sweetest marriage you can imagine watching on through the years. And she said at one point, she said, "I'm married and then I gave birth to a president." And so she's, you know, she was a lovely and devoted wife, and I'm glad America honored them.
Well, again, Dr. Merrill Matthews, any comments? Because if nothing else, we learned a lot of things about George Herbert Walker Bush that we didn't know, even though all of us around the table were around when he actually was president.
My favorite quote from him was when he made the statement that he was president of the United States and he didn't have to eat his broccoli. And I actually went home that day and said, if the president doesn't have to eat his broccoli, I'm not eating that stuff either.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
But you know what really impressed me, more so because I don't remember anything like this with Reagan and some of the other recent deaths, is when he came back to Texas. He takes that train going to College Station, and you have people who have lined up at the crossroads stuff, and with flags and so forth, just to get a chance to say hello to the train and wave at it as it's passing by.
I know, amazing.
I thought that was just something
it's almost
amazing.
A 19th century kind of event. Yeah.
Almost, and it just it just struck me that I don't remember anything quite like that.
Yes, and for those of us that love trains, 4141, and they're hoping to keep that train up there.
I'm a big train fan.
Yeah, so that is something. And Kelly Shackelford, something else. I mean, the most qualified individual ever to be in the Oval Office. We already talked about a war hero, but here's an individual who was a member of Congress. Here is an individual that headed up the CIA. He was the liaison first to China, then he was UN ambassador, and all that before he ran and became vice president and eventually became president. We've never had anybody with that kind of qualification sit in the Oval Office.
No, it really incredible. And as you mentioned, just a good sense of humor. Of course, Barbara Bush had a great sense of humor as well. But I actually had a good friend who was essentially the receptionist, the main person for the president. I think you know him as well. And he named them. His name, his POTUS, President of the United States.
Right.
He named her ROTUS, receptionist of the United States, which she just treasured. She loved that. And he, anyway, just a tremendous guy. I read the book by his son, George Bush, Decision Points.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And, I was just reading that about that President Bush's presidency. But the thing that really came through the book for me was how much I really respected his dad. I'd seen his dad in politics, but see his dad through his eyes in that book really was influential, and it just raised my level of respect for him. And I think that was probably the most powerful moment of the week was, George W. Bush giving the eulogy where he broke down towards the end. And I think every American could relate to that.
But touching base on what Debbie was mentioning about he could be considered a moderate to some extent today, he had, for those of us who were active in the political and policy world at the time, there were some troubling aspects of his presidency. And I was just listening today as a former Iraqi ambassador was talking about the fact when George Herbert Walker Bush came on, and I think this was on the after the Kuwait invasion, said, if you people in Iraq feel like you need to rise up against Saddam Hussein and overthrow him, we're there to support you. We agree with you on that. And he said the people in Iraq took that as a sign that if they rose up and tried to fight Saddam Hussein, that the U.S. would come into their defense, especially with the Kurds, and he did not do it. He eventually imposed a no-fly zone over the Kurdish area, but they said we felt like we were betrayed. And the commentator said, well, what about when his son came in and did that? And he said, well, it would have been a different response if you had done that initially, because by that time, Iraqis did not trust the Americans to come in and do things correctly. It was a very interesting response from an Iraqi person.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
That is a great point I hadn't really thought about. I also mentioned one other kind of positive thing. Back in 1989, when he gave his inaugural speech, he said he used his 1,000 points of light, and that was one thing what a lot of the critics kind of mocked him for, kind of simpery. I thought it was a great. Basically, he was saying the American people are good, noble, generous people. He was acknowledging the goodness of America and at the same time saying we can do a lot to help each other. The reason leftists despise that line is because they want government to do everything for people. And the idea of encouraging generosity in churches and foundations and charity to rise up and care for each other, it really cuts against the left's argument that the country just needs a massive government assistance programs, massive help, or else no one will ever help each other. And his reminder to the American people, no, we are good people. We do help each other. That's why they didn't like that statement. I love that statement because I think America's filled with good people.
I remember when we used to do broadcasts for A Point of View that sometimes we would have someone in that actually was one of the recipients of the 1,000 Points of Light designation. And so that was something significant. We come back from the break, though, a lot, we've talked about some of the positives. One mention, of course, of what happened in Iraq, but there is another one that oftentimes people say when you ask a president, what do you consider your biggest mistake? Well, he's sitting on the Supreme Court. That would be David Souter in this case. And other presidents have said things like that.
Which I noticed a number of things didn't highlight when they were talking about his accomplishments.
And we might talk about that for just a minute, because if you think of Kennedy and Souter, a lot of the things that now Kelly can be excited about getting done could have happened a long time ago. So I want to get your comments about that around the round table, but we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. Full bank of commentators and issues. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today is December 7th, a day that President Roosevelt said would be a date which would live in infamy. On that fateful morning of December 7th, 1941, America was attacked without warning. More than 2,400 Americans died and 1,100 were wounded. Our country was changed forever. This attack led us into war, and the citizens of America responded with courage and resolve. So it may be well to reflect on what took place and how we today must also rise to the occasion of an attack on America more than a decade ago. Today is known as National Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day. It is a day when we honor the lives lost in that attack on Pearl Harbor and also honor the veterans of World War II. But it can also be a day in which we also pay tribute to the men and women who are currently serving in the armed forces in an effort to promote freedom and justice around the world. If you travel to Hawaii, you need to stop at the memorial in Pearl Harbor. The USS Arizona stands as a testimony to the 1,177 crew members who died as a result of the attack on December 7th. I understand that more than 40 million visitors have visited that memorial and have therefore honored their heroic efforts of the sailors and Marines. If you've been there, you know that it has become a sacred place as well as a reminder of what can happen when others, either a nation or terrorists, attack this nation. In 1941, the enemies of the United States were Japan and Germany. Today, they're our friends. But we have new enemies, terrorists who want to destroy us and destroy our way of life. We are protected from their evil intentions by those who serve in uniform. So today, take a moment to reflect on your freedom that was bought with a price, and honor those who died for your freedoms and honor those who protect you today. December 7th is an important day, and I didn't want it to pass without challenging you to consider its importance. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We have today in the studio Debbie Georgatos and Dr. Merrill Matthews and Kelly Shackelford. And Dr. Matthews, let me come to you for just a minute because some of us are a little bit older, and for our younger listeners, they may not have known what was happening when George W. Bush put forward David Souter. Now, at the time, we were assured by John Sununu, and you can give some of the background there, to the fact that he was, even though a blank slate would be a good vote. Yeah, he was a good vote for the liberal wing the entire time he was there.
Yes, and Souter's probably the last one that wasn't sort of thoroughly, if undisclosed, vetted
yes.
in the background, because George Bush stepped up and nominated him, and I think a lot of us at the time said, who?
Yeah, and why?
Why him? And he got on, and he became one of the major liberal voices on there. It was and this is sort of, we've been talking so much about George Bush and sort of remembering him fondly, Bush 41. But there were things that he did that people were upset about in law, and I think that including the raising the taxes and so forth.
New taxes and that were enough for
read
Pat
my
Buchanan
lips,
to run
no new
against
taxes,
him. And Pat Buchanan could have defeated him. Again, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but if you go back and look at 1992, Pat Buchanan had a little bit of a run, and it could have been the unseating of an incumbent president, which happened later because another one of the people that he's known very well, Ross Perot, ran and took, 19% of the vote. 19%,
yeah.
But anyway, it brings me back, Kelly Shackelford, you were here last week reminding us that this is the first time since the 1920s we've had 5 reliable conservatives on the court. But again, if you could go back and rewrite history or change history, if you didn't have a Kennedy put forward by Reagan, and especially a Souter put forward by Bush, a lot of what you hope to accomplish now could have happened a quarter of a century ago.
Yeah, it's boy, talk about changing history, right? Everything that, I mean, if you think of how huge the Kavanaugh battle was because of what it means, that shows you what would have been happening over the last 25 years. Mm-hmm. The good news, though, coming forward now is I just don't think, I mean, point of view listeners, maybe you're going to be ahead of the ball game, but most people are not thinking about the change it kind of reminds me of the continental divide and the drop of water. We know where it's going to end up, but people aren't paying attention to that yet. And I think we're going to see a dramatic change. And yes, if President Bush had not listened to Sununu and said, trust me, that was back when, by the way, the Republican theory of how to pick judges to get them through was get people without a paper trail. That way they can't get them. Well, you know what? If you're 50-something years old, you've lived your whole life, and there's no paper trail to convict you of being conservative, you're probably not conservative, And so I think that was sort of the end of that. I know by the time we got to Alito, who had more opinions and more things in his past, and Bush said, okay, since you didn't like my Harriet Miers choice, I'll throw Alito out there. And he got through. I'll be darned, right? Yeah. And so everybody is since then is going, no more Souters, no more blank slates, no more trust me's.
No more Harriet Miers either.
You try that now in the Republican Party, and I mean they would go crazy. They don't want people that don't show that they're going to be consistent, that they're not going to be political, that they're going to be a proper judge, that they're going to be an originalist that defers to what the founders wrote or what the legislators wrote in the legislation, not to what they want to make it now. But Souter was a huge disappointment, and as you say, probably changed things for 25 years, delayed what is now finally happening, which is the first time in everybody who's listening. I mean, most of our lives. I mean, I don't know how many are listening that are old enough to remember this at all. Probably zero. It's the last time we've had 5 people on the court who actually want to follow the Constitution.
And that's one point. Oh, go ahead. One point I want to chime in for our listeners. I probably say this point in a similar way or many times, but when you watch the drama that happened in the United States Senate with the Kavanaugh confirmation, it could seem, if you sit back, that you're just watching a Democrats versus Republicans, just like a political campaign, like a political rally, because unless you pay close attention, you think it's just a battle between political parties or viewpoints. But really, what these are supposed to be are a question of, are you someone who will follow the Constitution, understands that the Constitution does govern, and you're not to be playing with it or treating it as a advisory only? And that's what really the dispute is at the federal level: is do your past decisions and statements, are they consistent with the notion of understanding that's what judge's job is, follow the Constitution, which can get you decisions of all kinds that you may or may not like, but that is the standard. And I also have heard after the Kavanaugh hearing, there was argument about, well, maybe we should just stop having such public hearings. We should just have this all behind the scenes, just a Judiciary Committee, no cameras, so no one can do the grandstanding. I'm not actually bothered by that. I think it might be a good way to just get the politics and the hysteria out of it. But I do think the vital thing about just having a reminder to everyone, and by the Republicans, the idea is finding people who follow the Constitution versus the make-up stuff version of the court or division of the court.
But in fairness, in highlighting the cause and effect aspect, you talked about how they were looking for somebody with no paper trail. There was a reason why they were looking for somebody with no paper trail, and that was Robert Bork, who had a huge paper trail. Yeah. And I remember Kerby at the time listening to you on Point of View saying along the lines of, because they've gone after Bork after his paper trail, it's going to drive them to try to find people who don't have a paper trail. And so they went to Souter for that. So there's this cause and effect things that happen out there, and oftentimes it creates more problems.
Well, it certainly did. But again, it just is an illustration of where we find ourselves today with that particular issue. And just before we go on, one of the articles I posted here is how the media has referred to the president, George Herbert Walker Bush, in such glowing ways, and yet here, at least one of the articles reminds us that he was referred to as a wimp, a racist, and a number of others. So, any thoughts about that?
The hypocrisy is pretty amazing. The current media is so detached from normal journalism, and it's just like they've lost all standards, and there's this Trump derangement syndrome, and everything fits into that narrative, and so all of a sudden, I mean, that's moving to the benefit of President Bush and his passing, because he's never been treated so well in his life. Because they're trying to, gig Trump, and so everything's about how can we get Trump, and so let's really focus on President Bush and how civil he was, and what a classy person he was, and it was like, well, why didn't you ever say any of that when he was alive? Why is it this only comes up when Trump's president? And it's because everything in their world is about seeing if they can take a shot at Trump, which is. It's sad. It's sad that we've lost basic journalism.
It is. And we were talking, I think, before the show started about during the coverage of President George H.W. Bush's funeral, there was a lot of discussion and commentary about, can't we have this, what a great guy, can't we return to the era of civility? This is how things should be conducted. But it is hypocritical to start with, because it wasn't that civil from the media side then. But now I think there's a notion that this endless argument, it isn't just in this context, but many other ones. Why can't we have a civil discussion? Why can't we have a robust exchange of ideas? And the answer is because we don't have that on many, many topics, because we have this kind of perpetual outrage society, perpetual outrage media, that everything you can discuss border security, and you either agree to ban the border, or you're a xenophobe, or the litany of issues in which we try to have an intelligent discussion, exchange of ideas, and the answer of the left is some label. Hater, xenophobic, homophobic, some other name. And so I don't know how that era of civility would happen today unless the right just conceded everything.
Well, that's kind of the circumstance we find ourselves in right now. Dr. Matthews, any other comments before we take a break?
It is the circumstance, and as Kelly pointed out, the media is just you have to read the media these days with something like jaundiced eyes. I mean, you just take it with a grain of salt.
Well, and again, one of the reasons I wanted to post that article is for our younger listeners. They won't realize that we mentioned Judge Bork, for example, and how Ted Kennedy goes to the well of the Senate and says, back alley abortions and racism and all those kinds of things. And then, of course, the racist comments about George Herbert Walker Bush because of the Willie Horton ad. And then the only time he got a little bit of credit is when he went against his read my lips, no new taxes, and actually violated that, all on the promise that there would be a spending cuts. They never seem to happen. Did you notice that?
A what cut?
Yeah. So, anyway, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to spend just a minute talking about what's happening in Austin. Many of you live in the state of Texas, and the Austin, Texas City Council is saying the churches may be required to hire homosexuals and transgender employees if this city ordinance is implemented. Love to talk about that with our roundtable guests, and we will do so right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, lots to talk about here today. It is our weekend edition, and we have posted lots of articles. Also, we have links to all of the guests around the round table. Of course, they are basically the co-hosts that have all at one time or another sat in this chair. So again, I want to thank each one of you, whether it's Debbie Georgatos, Buddy Matthews, or of course Kelly Shackelford. But I thought, since we are right at the moment broadcasting primarily into Texas, although again I acknowledge those of you in Minnesota and a few other places that carry this, the people that are hearing a lot of this are in Texas. I thought I would at least alert you to the fact that under a city ordinance being considered by the city of Austin, the city would have to guarantee the opportunity for each person to obtain employment without regard to race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, age, or disability. Now, most of those we would agree with, but when you start telling churches that they have to do so, that's the issue. And in the past, there's always usually been some kind of exemption, and that is not the case. So as a result, the U.S. Pastor Council and Texas Values, Kelly Shackelford and I were just at that event just recently, and of course that's an organization that was spun off by some of the things Kelly has done, have decided to sue the city of Austin over this ordinance. Debbie Georgatos, this is not the first time we've heard these kinds of things, but any thoughts?
I'm so glad you're calling this story to the attention of your listeners. And I did not know until I walked in today that you mentioned this. I didn't even know this controversy was occurring. But, number one, the idea that everyone involved in lawmaking and lawyers recognize that laws like this have traditionally had exemptions for churches and religious organizations. And I think it's very significant that they just decided, nope, no exemptions, nobody at all, because it really is it's a measure of the stridency of the advocacy of the LGBT activists in this country to say, our concerns, because it's not just, racial discrimination or something that is widely accepted. This is LGBT motivated in part, and this is no exemption needed, even for churches. It's first of all, a measure of the stridency of their advocacy, and second of all, a measure of just the disdain for the people who are trying to speak up about religious freedom, disdain for the notion that religious values actually matter to individuals, let alone to churches. And so I'm glad that they are pursuing it. I think it's going to be a interesting battle to have. I'm surprised Austin didn't just step back as soon as the lawsuit was filed, which is like October 6th. That was filed in federal court, U.S. District Court for the Western District. And so this is it's a good battle to have, and it's a good battle for a court to look at and decide, do religious values, are they sufficient to permit you to say we don't hire transgenders or whatever the position churches wants to take?
Well, one of the things that's happened is under the Civil Rights Act, that prohibited discrimination based upon race, gender, ethnicity, and sexual. Not sexual orientation. National orientation, right? And what happened is under the Obama administration, they decided to read into that the issues of gay, transgender, bisexual, and everything else that's going. And they started pushing that and making that part of the Civil Rights Act. The Trump administration has begun to push back on that in the education department, and we'll see where it goes. But a number of groups have picked up on this and said there's a Civil Rights Act out there, and we're taking all these things that Congress has actually never weighed in on, and we're including that under the banner. And my sense is at some point Congress is probably going to have to weigh in on this. Where do you want to draw that line?
And it should be Congress, not the president.
Exactly.
Expanding a federal law.
But here's the thing. Even if, the legislature does take action, if they do something like what they're talking about here in Austin, I mean, that's not something a legislature can do because the Constitution prohibits them from telling a church. This would mean, for instance, that a church cannot say, "Oh, I'm sorry, but you really can't be a candidate for our pastor because, of your beliefs and your positions on sexual orientation or transgenderism." The government has no authority to tell a church who they can hire as their pastor or their minister or any of the positions of the church. So this is one of those things that you have to have an exemption, and they don't, and it's going to be blatantly unconstitutional if they ever try to apply that to any church.
And this is, I think, is ultimately going to be challenged. The former head of the Civil Rights Commission had published a paper. This is, I'm thinking, like 3 or 4 years ago, along the lines of people are out there hiding their bigotry under the guise of religious freedom, and we're not going to let that happen. Now, that person's not head of the Civil Rights Commission anymore, but it's this new sort of wave of if you disagree with this, it's because you're a racist or a bigot and not because you have religious orientation. You're using that as a ruse to sort of cover your real racism there.
You know, and we always heard that this was, look, we just want fairness. We just want to be, you that are opposite sex can get married, so those of us same sex want to get married. You have certain benefits because you're married, and I don't because I'm in a relationship with somebody of the same gender. And so it was up until the latest Obergefell decision was sort of just, come on, we're just victims in all of this. But the moment that flipped, then it wasn't just, we want to have a live and let live kind of philosophy. It was, we're going to use the force of law to force you to do things that you would never do otherwise.
It is to force churches to agree that what they understand to be the meaning of the Gospels, the meaning of the Bible, that they're not entitled to believe that. They're not entitled to live out that faith. They can think whatever they want about the Bible's teachings relating to marriage and relationships, but it is the stridency of this leftist LGBTQ advocacy, which was, I agree, Kerby, greatly enhanced once Obergefell was decided by the Supreme Court, that just says it's not even enough for you to let us be married. You're going to agree that your understanding of your Bible, your scriptures, doesn't matter. You aren't entitled to live it out. It's a stridently intolerant.
And the goal has moved from acceptance, which is what it used to be, to toleration, then to acceptance, and now to affirmation.
Affirmation, yeah. Well
Forcing
said.
others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kelly, speak to this just before we take a break, because we've got a couple of minutes here. If Hillary Clinton were the president right now and you were having different judges being put on the Fifth Circuit, because this may go to the Fifth Circuit, might go, of course, to the Texas Supreme Court first, the decision would be rendered in a different way. And we're going to, in a few minutes, talk about how policies have consequences when we talk about what's been happening in France and things like that. But really, elections have consequences, and the kind of judges that will look at this, if this is appealed, are going to be the kind of people that are going to agree with the things you've just said.
Yeah, it's, you had, before this election, we had, and let's say even with Scalia on there and assuming let's say when replaced, let's say you go into the election, before we had 4 conservative, 4 liberal, and 1 who kind of went back and forth with Kennedy. Then Scalia died. And so if you look at that number going into the election, it was 3 conservative, 4 liberal, and 1 who jumped back and forth. So if Hillary had appointed that, there would have been 5 liberal. And so you name the issue, it was over.
It was over.
I don't care if it's the issue of abortion or gay marriage or religious freedom, it was going to be done. Now add to the fact that, there'd be 1 more, and instead, if there was a Hillary, you'd have 6.
6-3.
Yeah. And so so it would be even more so. Now, because you had an election, it went 4-4-1, which is kind of the way it was before. And then with Kavanaugh, it went really, the 1 was taken out, Kennedy, and it's now 5-4.
5-4.
For the first time, since the 1920s. And there very well might be another one next year, which would make it, 6-3 at that point. So you're talking a major difference, and we're talking a generational difference. I mean, this is something that's going to last a long time, and so that's why people are watching closely. But the big tipping point was the Kavanaugh, because now there's actually a majority for the first time in so long. And now it's just a matter of whether that will even increase more.
I was going to say, in the Kavanaugh confirmation to the Supreme Court, I do think there was so much controversy relating to allegations concerning his conduct back when he was in high school, and other women coming forward who've now actually admit they lied, made up their stories. But the Kavanaugh opposition from the left was not because of his personal behavior. That was a convenient excuse they had to try to bring him down. It was all about recognizing what Kelly was just saying, that he would cause an absolute clear conservative majority on the Supreme Court, and that's what they hope to prevent.
Let's take a break. When we come back for just a few more minutes, maybe I'll get a thought or two from some of you about the Texas legislature. We've had some very good conversations already with some of these legislators, and you might say, well, you already have a conservative majority in the House and Senate. Yes, but you didn't have a Speaker of the House that is obviously very different, and a couple of the people that we've had on during the noontime hour said they think this is a substantial improvement. Given Strauss anything could be an improvement. We'll be right back.
As America honors President George H.W. Bush, elected a mere 30 years ago, there's a sense that we are much further removed than that from his time in office. He famously dashed off thousands of thoughtful communications to world leaders and ordinary citizens, not electronically, but via the handwritten note. It was a different century, really a different era. Ted Cruz pointed out in his tribute to the former president that he was the last of the greatest generation to sit in the Oval Office. At age 18, this future president enlisted in the Navy, becoming one of the youngest pilots in the service. In 1944, his plane was hit by Japanese ground fire. He pressed the attack, but ultimately parachuted into the Pacific Ocean. He wondered, why had I been spared, and what did God have for me? Evangelicals praised the faith of his son, George W., but in an article titled George H.W. Bush Helped Lead the GOP Toward Evangelicalism, the Washington Post describes Bush 41's outspoken reliance on God for strength and his increasingly strong articulation of the party's pro-life position. My pastor brought up something I'd never heard before about the former president. In 1992, at a campaign event held at a New Hampshire insurance company, President Bush told employees, "You cannot be president of the United States if you don't have faith. Remember Lincoln going to his knees in times of trial and the Civil War and all that stuff? You can't be." Later, when faced with questions and critiques from atheist groups, the president doubled down on those remarks. He never backed down or equivocated on the idea that faith is essential to the presidency. Historian Gary Scott Smith wrote in his book Faith and the Presidency, From George Washington to George W. Bush, that George H.W. Bush mentioned prayer in 220 speeches, remarks, and proclamations while president, and the Lord was with him. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again for just a few more minutes. And again, we have Buddy Matthews and Debbie Georgatos as well as Kelly Shackelford. And Kelly, let me come to you for just a minute. We mentioned Texas Values, and of course, that is a group headed up by Jonathan Saenz, who I think very highly of. And we were just at his event, and we're going to have him on probably next week or two to talk about what's happened in the legislature. And of course, you've worked with him for years, but also for a long time, you were the policy group here in the state of Texas. So you've watched what's been happening here. And the sad reality is, as we say to our national audience, oftentimes we've seen good legislation in the House of Representatives go to die in the Senate. But in the Texas situation, it's been just the opposite. We've seen good legislation in the Senate that goes to die in the House, and that's because of the former Speaker of the House. We have the potential for a new Speaker. Does that change things?
Yeah, it definitely does. For those who are in different parts of the country, this is relevant really for everybody. I mean, Texas is one of the more conservative states in the country. And you've got a conservative House and a conservative Senate as a result at this point. They should be, and a conservative governor. So you should see lots of conservative legislation that then would be sort of the part of federalism. I mean, you'd have this conservative sort of laboratory where they would be trying, and we could see, does this conservative stuff work? And if it did, then other states would pick it up, whether conservative or not. They'd say, oh, well, this is good policy. But that hadn't been happening in Texas. Well, why not? Because even though you had a conservative House, conservative Senate, conservative governor, you had a Speaker of the House. Now, how do you elect your Speaker of the House? Most people would think, like let's take what the Democrats are doing.
Right, with Nancy Pelosi.
With Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah.
The Democrats go into a room and they say, we have the majority. Who do we want to be our Speaker? That's not how they did it in the Texas House. Only Republicans would do this, in my opinion. They're only people I know that would be this dumb. So what happened is they had like 10 Republicans say, maybe one of us wants to be Speaker, so we'll get all the Democrats, and 10 of us will be treasonous to our party, and then one of us can be Speaker. And that's what they did. And so Strauss, probably the most liberal Republican there was, became the Speaker, and most of his support was from the Democrats.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have conservative stuff that would want to go through, but you couldn't get it through the House.
Right.
Well, now he finally he knew he was done with. People were going to have no part of that anymore. And so there was a battle, and the new Speaker, he's not some rock hard conservative, but he's a Republican. He's not a liberal Republican. I'm probably a more moderate Republican than certainly the Freedom Caucus or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And so that makes a big difference. If he just let the House be the House, which is conservative legislation will go through. So that's the question. But nobody knows because they don't go into session until January. And so everybody's watching. Well, one of the first signs that just happened is something that's causing a lot of concern amongst conservative circles, and that is he just picked his parliamentarians, and instead of picking people who are conservative or whatever, he's just picked 2 Democrats to be the parliamentarian to make the big, calls on parliamentary procedure on huge votes or issues.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And people are worried about that. They're like, oh no, not another situation where we have a conservative House, but we have a Speaker who's not going to let those ideas win. I think it's too early to call, but everybody's watching that really closely, and it will affect the country because if that House is allowed to be a conservative House, then you're going to see conservative legislation come out of Texas that's probably stuff you haven't seen in the country because you just don't have this kind of a situation in very many places in the country.
Well, and the other advantage of that is we'll be watching is who ends up being committee chair and how the Rules Committee and some of those kinds of things run. But that has an impact. And if nothing else, I appreciate the fact that the state of Texas is always leading. Some individual that you've known for a long, long time, Ken Paxton, has been leading with a lot of the other attorney generals. And even more recently, one of the things we've been talking about is this whole issue of voter fraud. And the argument we constantly hear from our liberal friends is, well, there is no voter fraud. Now they're saying, well, maybe there is in North Carolina because Republicans.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Oh, all of a sudden, I think I found one in North Carolina. We need a special election. And I've always said, Ken Paxton, keep doing what you're doing because when you prosecute more and more people for voter fraud, which is what he's trying to do right now, it makes it really hard to say with a straight face there's no voter fraud when you have people paying penalties and sometimes doing hard time for voter fraud, right?
Well, that's right. And it's the voter fraud issue is real. As far as we know, it's not massive, but it does seem to be a bigger problem with online voting and mail-in ballots and so forth. That seems to be where,
yes.
And those who look at this closely say it tends to be a bigger problem for special elections. When you've got much smaller turnout, you can have a bigger impact. So it's a problem out there, and states have been trying to clean this up. Go to their go to voter ID and so forth, and they get a lot of pushback from it.
Well, again, you go to California every once in a while. I grew up in California, and they have a thing called ballot harvesting out there, which means that a third party can help collect people's ballots, which means I can go into the mailboxes and pull out ballots and fill them out, or go into the homes and say, here's how you want to vote, and you sign it. I think there's been a fair amount of voter fraud there in the state of California. What do you think?
Oh, they have a big problem in California. This most recent midterm election, they had 6 seats that had been held by Republicans for a long time in Orange County. It's kind of the small, tiny little bastion of conservatism.
Very true.
In California. And all 6 of those appeared on election night that the Republican won re-election. And as ballot harvesting, as it's now called, was occurring, which meant mail-in ballots that couldn't get counted in time on election night, as they began counting them, it turns out all of those seats went to the Democrats. And on my own radio show, I had on an expert from Heritage Foundation describing what actually happens. It is exactly as you're saying, Kerby. It is mail-in ballots where you have someone who's a senior citizen. It may even happen where the person who's homebound or senior never even sees the ballot. They're lured into filling out the application for it. The person takes it out of their mail. The harvester takes it out of their mail. The person never sees it. They fill out a ballot. The harvester, the cheaters, fill out the ballot, send them back in. And anyway, they have a massive problem in California, and they are investigating it. But it's really hard in California because it's a one-party state. There's not a lot of motivation to try to prosecute these people.
Yeah, well, John Fund, call your office, or Hans von Spaskowski.
That's what I had on my show. He was excellent. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I know. I wasn't going to add anything to that.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to get your comments because this whole idea of voter fraud, I think, is a big issue, and I appreciate the fact that at least Ken Paxton's taking it on here in the state of Texas.
I mean, you've got people going to jail, which is appropriate. I mean, that's a serious thing when people are engaging in voter fraud. I mean, if people aren't punished, then people won't be worried about continuing to engage in voter fraud on larger and larger levels. So I think having examples of people who are actually being punished is really important to send a message to everybody else. This is not something you want to be involved in.
But going to a point you made earlier, Kerby, what's going on in North Carolina,
Go for it.
And then, of course, Stacey Abrams in Georgia is now sort of alleging that there was problems with the whole election process, with people being taken off the road, the cleansing of the rolls and so forth, purging the rolls. So you may get Democrats coming up here in the near future saying, there actually may be a problem here, but they only found it when Democrats
lost. Yeah.
When Democrats win, there's no voter fraud. Democrats lose, and all of a sudden that is the case. And again, one of the reasons they purge the rolls are not because they're being mean, but because that's allowed under the motor voter laws.
Right.
And we have
required in some states.
Yeah, and we have more than 200 counties, last time I looked, where we have more people registered than we have people of voting
Why is that
age.
a problem?
And there's just too much potential for mischief. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that issue of voter fraud up. But when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of issues. First of all, we got 2 articles from our friends at the Institute for Policy Innovation. And the one by Dr. Merrill Matthews maybe helps us explain what is happening in France right now. Riots over a gas tax. Of course, at $7 a gallon, I might think about it myself. And then also the idea of the First Step Act, which your colleague has been working on as well. So we've got a lot to cover. We will do so right after these important messages.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition, and we have a round table of guests to really try to give you some perspective on this, but a little bit later. Of course, we'll open up the phones to get your perspective as well. And around the round table, we have Debbie Georgatos, so a talk show host and author and activist, and Kelly Shackelford, the head of First Liberty Institute and a lawyer as well, and then Dr. Merrill Matthews, who I'm going to come to pretty quickly here as we go to the second article we've posted on our website. But just as an introduction, earlier in the week we quoted from Ben Shapiro. He had a piece that came out about policies have consequences, and he says, you know, people make statements, they implement policies, and they think there's never going to be any repercussion.
Right.
And the example he used was about the stock market. President Trump says, hey, on Monday we're doing well, and we've got a good arrangement with the Chinese, and the stock market goes up about 250 points. On Tuesday, he dubs himself, I'm a tariff man.
Yes.
And it drops, and its stock market is still
going.
dropping. And so that was one illustration. But the one I want to come to is he also said, the yellow vests. And this brings us to a piece that we've posted by Dr. Merrill Matthews, which we did mention earlier in the week. The French tell President Macron where to stick his gas tax. Now, when you raise the cost of gasoline because, quote, you want to deal with climate change, and you require people to pay what effectively becomes $7 a gallon, you can see why some people came into the streets, and we had riots in France. Talk about that.
Right. The what's happened is that President Macron, and as a lot of elitist progressives want to do, is make sure they have a legacy that they're supposed to be fighting climate change. So what he decided to do was to raise the gas tax in France of roughly 25 to 30 cents to start with, and then continuing on up after that. Well, gas already cost a little over $7 a gallon in France, according to the AP, and
I can't believe it. Yeah.
And this is, and I went and checked the incomes. The French, on average, make about 2/3 of what we do, about a third less. And so when you're looking at roughly, I think, $140 for a 20-gallon gas of tank, you're talking about a lot. You're talking about a lot of money here.
Yes,
that's a lot of money for somebody who makes significantly less income than we do. And this was a spontaneous group of people who came up. They were never, the media were surprised that they never seemed to have a real leader there. They just started coming out in the streets in Paris and in other places, put on these yellow vests, and that sort of identified them, and they went into riots. They eventually turned violent here in the last Saturday and Sunday. And so Macron said, we're not repealing this. We're not taking this back, until finally he decided we're going to take it back. We're going to put it on hold for 6 months. And my guess is that means if things die down, then it will go in. If they don't, then we'll do something else. But it's a huge tax on French working people. And gas taxes are some of the most regressive taxes that you have out there.
Well, explain that, because I think that was something that I think was even more significant.
A regressive tax is one that hits it hits everybody the same, and that means lower income people get hit harder because they have less discretionary income to be able to spend on it. A progressive tax, which is what liberals typically want, is one that makes higher income people pay more, lower income people pay less or nothing at all. And so a gas tax hits everybody the same. And so it would, if you have a modest income, you're a working class person in France and you have a modest income, this takes a big chunk out of your income. And so it's very non-progressive in his normal sense of wanting to try to be progressive. But again, I think part of what this is meant to do is for him to try to create a legacy, and he didn't care how much the French had to pay for him to be able to get that legacy. Now he's pushed back because his poll numbers were already very low, and they were sinking even further.
Last time I looked, it was like 23% approval rating and dropping from there.
Which is still twice what Congress is, but that's another issue.
There's another. And I might just point out, for some people say, well, then they just wouldn't have to drive. No, that would also have affected electric
That's
costs.
right. They do have more public transit in France, but out in the country you don't. And that's the same thing true here in the United States. If you're in Washington, D.C., Chicago, New York City, you have access to a lot of public transit. When you get out into the rest of the country, you oftentimes don't have that in any sort of easily accessible way.
Yes. Well, and again, this is kind of interesting because they aren't burning as much carbon as others, because in France, nuclear power
is a major source there, and so they haven't had to do that as much. Germany had been getting a cleaner record, but after the nuclear power problem in Japan, Germany began to scale back on that and started going to coal again, and so they talk a good record about wanting to be cleaner on our environment, but they expanded their coal significantly because they were cutting back on their nuclear power.
Well, let's talk about this too, because some people will say, well, that's over France, it doesn't affect us. Well, my commentary yesterday was on the so-called Green New Deal. Alexia Ocasio-Cortez and others are saying it's time to have a Green New Deal. So the same kind of ideas that President Macron implemented in France, some of the incoming members at least in the Democratic Party, coming into the House want to implement here in the United States.
I can't believe you that's exactly where I was going to go with this, which was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was elected surprise victory over a long-term Democrat, beat him in a primary Democrat district. She's now a member of Congress, and she has a bachelor's degree from BU, Boston University in economics. Let that sink in. But she's very much of an advocate. She's openly socialist, very much of an advocate. And part of her, as you were just saying, one of her proposals is the Green New Deal, and she wants to have America be completely dependent on sustainable energy, like wind and solar and all that. And I haven't forgotten the years she's targeted, but it was one of those things that sounds so great in theory when it doesn't cost anything. But I'm going to guess she's sitting in her office, if she reads news, and she's realizing, wow, this is kind of a real life impact we're seeing in France, that people actually don't want to have to be forced to pay so much more than they currently are. And I'll tell you a funny little tidbit about her. She's announced every member of Congress has a specific budget that they have to cover their office expenses, and it includes staff and administration and mailing and whatever it is. She's announced that she is going to pay all of her interns at least $15 an hour. Well, whatever they get now, she's going to have to deal with economic reality, because she can't pay them that and still have all the money she'll need for everything else. It's kind of like watching a person grow up,
That's good. Budgets are complicated things, aren't they?
She's got an economics degree, and one of your colleagues, Lathan, said that any of you out there with an economics degree right now, you might want to find another degree. Any of you that are majoring in economics might too, because every time she opens her mouth, she devalues your degree. She got 4 Pinocchios the other day.
Yes, she did.
Did you see on that one?
I did see.
$21 trillion from the Pentagon, which the Pentagon never had $21 trillion. Is 2/3 of the way they're paying for Medicare for all.
When we come back from the break, I will tell you how the Congress at one point decided had some green dreams that they were going to try to impose on the country, and how far they've fallen short on that, which will give us an indication of just how close we can get to 100% renewable energy anytime soon.
Yes. Well, again, think back on 2009, the Reinvestment Act. You might remember that, by President Obama. How's that working out for you here? Some of those green companies didn't do so well. So Dr. Merrill Matthews is the expert on energy policy. We'll come back and get some of his comments, and we've got a lot more to cover. We haven't even gotten into some of the other very good material from the Institute for Policy Innovation. And, of course, we're going to hear Kelly talking about some of the things at First Liberty. We just got lots to cover, and we'll do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today is December 7th, a day that President Roosevelt said would be a date which would live in infamy. On that fateful morning of December 7th, 1941, America was attacked without warning. More than 2,400 Americans died and 1,100 were wounded. Our country was changed forever. This attack led us into war, and the citizens of America responded with courage and resolve. So it may be well to reflect on what took place and how we today must also rise to the occasion of an attack on America more than a decade ago. Today is known as National Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day. It is a day when we honor the lives lost in that attack on Pearl Harbor and also honor the veterans of World War II. But it can also be a day in which we also pay tribute to the men and women who are currently serving in the armed forces in an effort to promote freedom and justice around the world. If you travel to Hawaii, you need to stop at the memorial in Pearl Harbor. The USS Arizona stands as a testimony to the 1,177 crew members who died as a result of the attack on December 7th. I understand that more than 40 million visitors have visited that memorial and have therefore honored their heroic efforts of the sailors and Marines. If you've been there, you know that it has become a sacred place as well as a reminder of what can happen when others, either a nation or terrorists, attack this nation. In 1941, the enemies of the United States were Japan and Germany. Today, they're our friends. But we have new enemies, terrorists who want to destroy us and destroy our way of life. We are protected from their evil intentions by those who serve in uniform. So today, take a moment to reflect on your freedom that was bought with a price, and honor those who died for your freedoms and honor those who protect you today. December 7th is an important day, and I didn't want it to pass without challenging you to consider its importance. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we have Dr. Merrill Matthews, Debbie Georgatos, and Kelly Shackelford in studio with us today. And let me, if I can, have you take us back, Dr. Matthews, to an energy policy implemented, I believe it was in 2007.
2007.
Explain that.
The Democrats controlled the House and Senate now, and George Bush had said we were addicted to oil and we need to stop that. So the Democrats passed legislation, the Energy Independence and Security Act, which increased the mandates for ethanol in our gas tanks. And especially advanced biofuels, cellulosic biofuels. This was going to be corn husk and all these other things that they were going to be turning into gasoline. So the Democrats proposed this. The industry out there, the green industry, said, absolutely, we can make this stuff and we can make it in huge quantities and we can make it affordable. So they passed it, 2007, supposed to start in 2010. 2010 comes along where they weren't actually able to make any. Get to 2011. Well, we actually haven't been able to make any yet. 2012. We're working on it.
I'm seeing a trend here.
2013. I think by 2013 or 2014 they were to get like 10,000 gallons or so.
Right.
So you have this mandate by Congress that they have to do more and more. So as of last year, the mandate from the law from 2007 was that they would have 5.5 billion gallons, billion with a B. The industry was actually able to make 10 million gallons, which is a lot, but it's a long way from 5.5 billion gallons.
Yeah, so again, sometimes this is a good example of policies have consequences, which was something we talked about earlier in the week. You can wave a wand, and for example, in Seattle, they required everybody to have a $15 an hour minimum wage, and the University of Washington concluded that what it essentially did was force all sorts of people out of work, and the average loss to those who still kept their jobs was not a plus, it was a negative.
or you can decide that all your interns are going to get paid $15 an hour, or you can decide that we're supposed to have 5.5 billion gallons of this particular kind of ethanol. And you can wave a wand and hope that that's going to happen, but it doesn't actually happen.
And the point there is Ocasio-Cortez is going to say we absolutely can move to 100% renewable energy in the very near future. She will get a lot of environmentalists and others agreeing with her. But when you start trying to do it, getting those planes to fly on solar panels is going to be really tough.
That's so good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Related to that, too, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a lot of the left-wing thinking, the socialist thinking is, because I really care about poor people, I want life to be fairer. I want to have everyone have access to more or less relatively equal wages and free health care, all the things that make life fairer. But the fact is, just like Macron's figuring out in France, when you impose policies that actually raise the cost of living life, of driving a car, it is the poorest people, to the point Dr. Matthews is making just a few minutes ago, those kind of things hit hardest the poorest people. And even on the minimum wage changes, like in Seattle, the companies that are forced to pay $15 an hour to someone who's really only contributing about $8 an hour maybe to the value of their business, they're not going to just eat their profits. They're going to raise their prices, again, hurting the poorest people. All these ideas that have such a fanciful appeal to the socialist mindset, at the net end of the day is you hurt poor people because you drive prices up and what they want to buy costs more.
Yeah. Well, and also in the state of Washington, it was interesting. Voters actually rejected the carbon tax that was tried to be implemented. So, again, sometimes, Dr. Matthews, we see France and we go, well, that's France, those are French people. But it's coming back to affect us, and those same ideas don't stay in France. They make their way over to this country, too.
That's absolutely right, because we have gas taxes as well. And, of course, California raised their gas tax last year. They had a referendum on that this year, because in California you can do an initiative referendum and bring that up. I think it stayed in. But yes, we do that, and our gas taxes are not nearly as high as they are in France. But that's only because we don't have the same politicians, and we may be getting some more of those in the near future.
Well, it will be interesting to see how that plays out. This is one of the articles that we've posted from our friends at Institute for Policy Innovation, IPI.org. I thought I'd mention one other one before we take a break, and that is a piece that was really kind of a coalition letter signed by your colleague, Tom Giovanetti, and there was an attempt to try to pass in both the House and the Senate, and the House passed a bill which is called the First Step Act, and then it went to the Senate and kind of morphed a little bit more into a sentencing act. There was a hope that there would be some action during the lame duck session, but I'm not so sure. Where are we standing?
Well, from what I understand from Mitch McConnell today, it's probably not going to get to the Senate floor because he has nominees, judicial nominees, and other things he wants to try to get done. They've got to get a budget passed, at least a 2-week extension, and so forth. So, plus, I think he's not sure that he has the votes for it. But it's a bipartisan legislation. There's been, among a number of conservatives, a movement over the past, I'd say, 4, 5, 6 years to try to have prison reform, judicial reform, and so forth, so that people who are put in jail for nonviolent offenses, maybe minor drug use or something of that nature, have a chance to get out and get rehabilitated and get back into the workplace. And this has been you have both liberals and conservatives moving towards this. Some people have pushed back on this. Senator Tom Cotton has been opposed to this. But you've got others who are for it, and it doesn't look like I think it's going to make it through this time. You have some concerns raised about it, but I think in general, we have here in Texas the Right on Crime group, which is tied in with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which has worked very hard to try to get some prison reform and other things passed here, which we believe, which in Texas believe they've actually lowered the criminal rate, the crime rate, lowered the recidivism rate, and some other things like that. So it's meant to try to follow on what Texas has done.
Kelly, let me come to you because we've had Star Parker on this program. We've had Rebecca Hagelin on this program. We've had other people that have talked about some of the successes in the state of Texas. If this could be implemented, it says that we're not soft on crime. Nobody would think of Rebecca Hagelin having been with the Heritage Foundation or Star Parker as being soft on crime. But at the same time, it doesn't make sense to put nonviolent offenders in prison, teach them how to be better prisoners and things of that nature. So it seems to me that there's some things that really could happen if we ever were to pass this piece of legislation.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is an example of federalism. You know, the idea is the states try things. Yeah. You look at what the evidence is, and they've tried it, and it actually worked. I mean, it reduced the prison population, which is good on two levels, right? How did that happen? Well, what that means is when there's less people in prison, it means, absent, we got rid of the police. That's why nobody's in prison. I mean, that wasn't the reason, right? It means that there are less crimes of people who were in prison and let out. They're not going back, is what was happening. The recidivism rate was going down. So that not only is good in that there's less crime that people are affected by it, but it also is good for the economy because now the state doesn't have to pay for all these prisons that are unnecessary. Now, the idea, though, is you want anybody that has violence or, these are violent crimes or they could be a danger to other people. Those are not people you want to let out early. But anybody else, it's like, first, why put somebody in prison longer when that's not really going to do anything for them if they're not a violent situation? And number two, everybody who's going to get out, why don't you make sure that you do what you can to affect their lives before you let them go so that they're less likely to come back in? And so this is one of those things where, a conservative group really was behind this and got it through in Texas, a very conservative state, and yet it was really good, and it's the type of thing that, Democrats and Republicans can agree on.
One of the things they're trying to push back on is mandatory sentences.
There you go.
And that's one of the things that, and that was a reaction to things happening in the 70s and early 80s, I believe, when you had a lot of crime running
cocaine
around.
And that kind of stuff.
And it seemed like some judges were giving people too much of a pass on this. So mandatory sentences were passed, and now they're coming back and saying, well, maybe we need to give the judges a little more flexibility in being able to determine what needs to be here. Because sometimes you'll hear the judge say, I've got to send you to prison for such and such, but that's because the law requires me to do that. It's not what I would do.
Yeah. Well, remember the example of the the president pardoned a woman who was massively over-sentenced in a drug crime.
Very true.
And, that kind of thing, I think, I wonder, the rumor is McConnell doesn't want this to come to a vote because he's got lobbyists who are getting paid from all these prisons, right? And so you hope that kind of thing isn't affecting. They should vote on this. There's no reason for them not to vote on this. And it's something the president supports. You've got bipartisan support. And if it doesn't, it certainly ought to come back up with the new Congress. And it should be something that they should be able to support.
Let me give some of you a chance to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. Since the call's coming in, might as well open up the phones. So that's the case. And again, you can find some of the material we've posted on that because about 86% of those individuals in these federal prisons are non-violent, oftentimes small-time offenders. So we'll come back and talk more about that and what's happening in the Senate with some of these judicial nominees right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of view can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
I'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Debbie Georgatos, Dr. Merrill Matthews, as well as Kelly Shackelford. We're talking at the moment about the First Step Act, but we were talking about economics and we were talking about energy and fuel. So let me take at least one of those calls before we get too far down the road. And we'll head up to our state of Alaska, KJNP. I've been to that station before, been to that particular region in Alaska. Elmer, what is your thoughts about this whole issue of energy policy?
Well, I guess I'd start with I want to remember that that some economists who were in the U.S. in government that Phil Graham was an economist, and I want to remember that John
Dick
Snow
Armey
was an
too.
economist.
Yeah, I felt better when we had
Dick
really
Armey,
qualified economists in the Congress. Phil Graham.
Those are both
I
PhD
mean,
economists.
Yes. Yeah.
I may have something that I have more respect for Dick Armey, but I have zero for Phil Graham. And you might remember that the Glass-Steagall thing that was repealed was Phil Graham's baby, and that he got in with UBS, and John Snow got in with Cerberus and some of these other. Well, I'm an investor, and I want an equal playing field, and I want a fair shake at investing, and I don't like short selling, and I don't like those other things that goes on in the stock market. And these things have been promoted and accepted, and I think it was O'Neill that was another O'Neill was Treasury Secretary for Mr. Bush, the younger, for GW, and he got fired because he wanted some reasonable regulation, and So I'm a little dismayed with you guys and your smugness, laughing about the left. When I listen to your program, and I don't donate to public radio. I quit donating, but I also find it hard to donate when you guys are so smug in your attitudes about your own mistakes, about conservative mistakes, and how it treats the individual investor. We're small investors, and we want people to invest. And we want capital markets, but we cheat the small investor. And so when that happens, it just undermines your credibility.
I'm not sure how we're cheating the small investor. Could you clarify that?
Well, I'm talking about when you don't recognize stock options, when you allow reporting requirements to not reflect the reality, the total reality of a company's books. Those kinds of things, particularly what I remember specifically was the options thing, about recognizing options that were and putting them on the books. So
you're talking about a CEO's options for pay and so forth, right?
Not just a CEO, but senior executives.
And they have changed that, though, have they not? Because I believe that was a problem.
It wasn't. Yeah, but it wasn't their doing. It was fought long and hard. And in fact, Glass-Steagall was another thing that was bad.
But that wasn't fought by conservatives in the stock options.
Well, it was.
That was fought by business.
It was the only way it was able to pass was because conservatives bought into it.
Elmer, conservatives and business people are not always the same.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, again, I wasn't trying to be smug about some of those. We haven't really talked about some of those issues, but it's an important point, because I'm one to be an equal opportunity grief giver whenever there are issues of crony capitalism.
Yes, indeed.
We certainly speak out on those issues.
I can't think of anybody at this roundtable that has ever been in favor of business crony capitalism. I mean, I'll never forget when we were sitting here and when President Bush.
Oh, yes. I remember that.
Yeah.
You saying
when
that,
President, I mean, this is President Bush. He's a Republican, okay? And,
Which one?
the
George W.
George W. When we had the stock market crash, and he said, and this is the quote, he said, I had to abandon free market principles to save the free market economy. And my head exploded. And, so I think we've always been pretty consistent on being pro-free market. What you find, there's a unique people assume, for instance, that those who are conservative or whatever are for big business, and that's not true at all. It's never been true. Now, are you going to find the Chamber of Commerce? But go now and talk to anybody who's a conservative group, whether they're a social conservative group or even a fiscal conservative group, and ask them what they think about the Chamber of Commerce. Okay, they don't consider that a conservative group. So I think to kind of do with the broad brush and say that that anybody here, I've never heard anybody here. I mean, it'd be interesting. I don't know anybody here who's sat here and been against free market principles and those things, because they're sort of crony capitalism and big business and all that, it's usually the opposite.
Yeah. Another piece where I think here and other places you hear conservatives generally speaking out against big business is because big business has been pushing Congress to be lax on immigration, to let more people come here, even if it ends up hurting the American worker, and giving jobs, but that because less can be paid to foreign workers. I mean, that's a big business issue that pushes Congress pushes conservatives to fail to do the right thing legislatively because they want to humor the big business who wants his low-wage workers. And I'm way into I want free markets. I want America as founded in the Constitution, and that puts me mostly in the Republican side. But I'm very happy to criticize. I'm an equal opportunity criticizer.
Well, let me at least point a couple of things that Elmer had mentioned in there, which is short selling, for instance. Now, short selling is where you borrow stocks, right. And then you end up, if the stocks go down, you end up making a profit from that. I understand short selling. I've never really understood it in the way that, I'd feel like, man, that's something I'd want to do. But having said that, there are people who take advantage of that. And there's a fund manager who used to go buy short pharmaceutical stocks, and then he would file a challenge to a patent on a pharmaceutical company, and then their stock would start dropping, and he would make money off of it. I don't know that that's a free market thing or not, but I oppose those kinds of things where you're trying to manipulate it. And then, of course, you had the Michael Lewis's book, Flash Boys, where there was a way where you can go and people were coming into the stock market, buying things real quickly, and we're talking about in fractions of seconds, so they could turn around to sell somebody else who's trying to buy it and make a little bit of profit off that. So they've tried to pull some of those things and address some of those issues. So I certainly don't want to say there's nothing that doesn't go on inappropriate among investors, but I don't know that conservatives necessarily support those things.
No. And again, you can think of all sorts of various regulations that have come down in the last couple of years to, quote, solve the 2008 crisis or the 2000 crisis that have done more harm than good. So I think that is certainly the case. One of the things we were talking about is this idea of a vote on the First Step Act. And if Mitch McConnell is not going to get a vote on that, Kelly, it brings me to one other point. That is, what is he going to vote on? And if you go to firstliberty.org/judicial maps, I thought I just might mention that people can actually see the votes coming in these circuit courts. And if indeed, during this lame duck session, if Mitch McConnell can get just a few more through, that's going to make your life a whole lot easier, isn't it?
Yeah, what's going on right now is incredibly frustrating because the Republican side has only a 51-49 number. It's easy to kind of throw a wrench into the whole system, and of course it takes a special person to do that, and of course we have that in Senator Flake, who
special's one way to say it.
I'm being as nice as I know how. The idea that he stopped maybe 50 judicial nominees from being confirmed by the end of the year. Why? Because he has a problem with any of these people? No. Because he's pitching a fit that he doesn't get a vote on something that's massively unconstitutional. So they're not going to bring it up for a vote because it's unconstitutional. And of course, it wouldn't be signed by the president anyway if they got it through. So he's asking for a meaningless vote on a meaningless bill that's unconstitutional. And because he's not getting what he wants in a juvenile tirade, he's saying, I'm going to stop all the judicial nominees. And so we've got about 50 judges who could be on the court serving. These are solid, constitutionalists, originalists who don't want to be politicians. I mean, for the first time really that I've ever seen, this is the best crop of people we've ever been picking for these courts, and they're lifetime appointments, and they're being held up. And so what's going to happen is, many of these are now going to have to be renominated again after the end of the year. We're going to have to go through the process again. It's going to take months to get started again. And so many people are very upset. There's a number of weeks in a row now where they've had to cancel the Judiciary Committee hearings, and where a number of these people that would be through right now are not getting through, and it's clogging up and just really delaying, which the Democrats are just thrilled by. Because they like the fact they've been doing the 30-hour rule to just clog things up. And so all these judges are not getting voted on. But you're right. We keep track of all that. They can go to firstliberty.org And just, under judges, we have maps that show how many have gotten through, which seats are open, which seats are being filled. And I think that's going to pick up really heavily after the new Senate is seated January 3rd.
Again, interactive maps, firstliberty.org/judicial maps. And I think you'll learn a little bit more about the judiciary and also see what's happening, or in some cases not happening, in the Senate. We'll be right back.
As America honors President George H.W. Bush, elected a mere 30 years ago, there's a sense that we are much further removed than that from his time in office. He famously dashed off thousands of thoughtful communications to world leaders and ordinary citizens, not electronically, but via the handwritten note. It was a different century, really a different era. Ted Cruz pointed out in his tribute to the former president that he was the last of the greatest generation to sit in the Oval Office. At age 18, this future president enlisted in the Navy, becoming one of the youngest pilots in the service. In 1944, his plane was hit by Japanese ground fire. He pressed the attack, but ultimately parachuted into the Pacific Ocean. He wondered, why had I been spared, and what did God have for me? Evangelicals praised the faith of his son, George W., but in an article titled George H.W. Bush Helped Lead the GOP Toward Evangelicalism, the Washington Post describes Bush 41's outspoken reliance on God for strength and his increasingly strong articulation of the party's pro-life position. My pastor brought up something I'd never heard before about the former president. In 1992, at a campaign event held at a New Hampshire insurance company, President Bush told employees, "You cannot be president of the United States if you don't have faith. Remember Lincoln going to his knees in times of trial and the Civil War and all that stuff? You can't be." Later, when faced with questions and critiques from atheist groups, the president doubled down on those remarks. He never backed down or equivocated on the idea that faith is essential to the presidency. Historian Gary Scott Smith wrote in his book Faith and the Presidency, From George Washington to George W. Bush, that George H.W. Bush mentioned prayer in 220 speeches, remarks, and proclamations while president, and the Lord was with him. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, and we have the full roundtable of commentators today. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about some of these different individuals, we have a link to each one. Of course, Dr. Merrill Matthews at ipi.org. And, of course, we just mentioned a minute ago, firstliberty.org. And, of course, America Can We Talk? And so we'll talk about some of those in just a minute. But one of the other articles we've posted is the perpetual presidency. And I predicted, and Kelly and I think sort of thought that when we saw that Donald Trump would come into office and Barack Obama would leave office, we thought we'd be hearing from President Barack Obama every day. Now, surprisingly, he waited a year or so. But interestingly enough, now we're hearing from him all the time. And Victor Davis Hanson has written a piece where the subtitle is, Obama believes that all of Trump's successes are due to Obama, and all of Trump's setbacks are his own. Is the stock market doing so well? Not at the moment, but in the past, and the rise in median family income, Dr. Merrill Matthews, due to the policies of Barack Obama or due to Donald Trump?
No, they weren't. And that's why he kept going around trying to argue that you had a stagnation, especially of the middle class, and that's one of the reasons why he said we've got to raise the minimum wage and do other things, because the middle class was not expanding and improving and seeing their incomes rise. I would argue it was almost entirely due to Barack Obama's policies, and that once he's out of office and Donald Trump came in and set in some new policies, you see a number of things begin to start doing a quick uptick. Some of that has been put on hold now, I would argue mostly because of the trade war that's going on. But when you go back and look at the graphs from various economic issues at the time, usually around November, December 2016, January 2017, they all start going up again.
Yeah. Well, and again, we expected that there might be an occasional weighing in, but I love this, what Victor Davis Hanson says. With the passing of George Herbert Walker Bush, there are now 4 living ex-presidents, Carter, Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama. There are also 5 living former vice presidents, Walter Mondale, Dan Quayle, Al Gore, Dick Cheney, and Joe Biden. If all the ex-presidents and all the ex-vice presidents were to weigh in nonstop on the current president and present-day politics, the result would be chaotic as well as it would be boring.
You know, on Obama weighing in so harshly and perpetually against President Trump, first, to try to claim credit for the current economy based on Obama's policies, that could be the case if Trump hadn't changed economic policy. I mean, if President Trump came into office and just perpetuated Obama's policies and the economy got better, you'd say, well, okay, this is a long-term effect.
Long-term,
but
yeah.
obviously, Dr. Matthews is exactly right. President Trump drastically changed economic policy, which gave rise to the bursting economy, the job market, the low unemployment rate, the return of jobs. All of that is due to actual significant change in policies put in place by President Trump. And so to try to claim for past policies that had 8 years of failure, that somehow the good news is because of that. But the deeper point on Obama I was going to mention just briefly is the Obama presidency was not just who happened to win a presidency for 2 terms. It was very much of a left-wing attempt to radically shift America's course to the radical left. And so this is this was going to be, Hillary was going to follow on. She'd perpetuate his very left-wing policies, consolidation of power at the federal level, less and less, more and more regulation, less and less free market economy, free enterprise elements and thinking in America's society. This is what President Obama thought he started. And when Hillary lost, and he came to the realization that President Trump was going to drastically return America to more to more being based on free market principles, advocacy of entrepreneurship, keeping the federal government limited, reducing regulation. It wasn't just that he changed President Obama's policies, that President Trump began to right the ship, putting it back on the track that America, consistent with its founding, was meant to be. And this is why Obama can't stop talking.
Well, the other thing I would say about the Obama talking is I think it's really pretty damaging to the Democratic Party for him to be speaking so much. They need a new leadership. They need messaging and things and they need to find out who are their voices. But he crowds all that out. I mean, he's their former leader, so he doesn't really he sort of casts a shadow where nobody else can really rise up to be the next one. And so he really cripples his own party as he does this over and over again. So I know he can't resist himself, but it's funny how they talk a lot about class and they go after Trump because Trump is kind of brutish and rude and all this. To me, this is the same level. You don't see George W. Bush. You never saw George W. Bush doing this to Barack Obama. You need to have the dignity and the class and the tradition as a former president to shut up. You had your turn. Okay, if you want to say something to support somebody, you can call them on the phone. But you had your time, and help your party, help the issues you want. But former presidents don't do this, and I think it's not good for the country. It's not good for your party. It's not really good for anybody. For you to come out and act like you're going to be king or president again. I mean, we don't need your perpetual leadership for the history of the country.
Well, and again, if that's a shadow, you say, who's the next person to run? Of course, Joe Biden the other day was saying he's the most qualified to run, and probably true if you really go down to that. Because if you were to go out right now with a microphone and ask people on the street, who do you think is the Democratic nominee 2 years from now, I'm not sure they would come up with any other name other than Joe Biden. Maybe they'd say Hillary Clinton's running.
What
again.
about Beto O'Rourke?
Well, that might in
or
Texas
Bernie
work.
Sanders.
Bernie Sanders.
The polls have got
Yeah.
Biden first and Bernie second, usually.
Yeah, maybe it'd be those, but any of those other lesser knowns, you know. Do they know Cory Booker? You know, Spartacus? Do they know Kamala Harris? I don't know. Yeah.
There was an interesting thing at the Boston Globe came out with a very harsh editorial today. I think it was yesterday or today, just basically saying to Elizabeth Warren, who is the Democrat senator from Massachusetts, who's been floating. She recently admitted, okay, I'm kind of open to running for president. They basically said, please don't. It was the Boston Globe, a liberal newspaper.
Globe.
Yeah,
Surprising.
so and so I think she's one who fancies herself as she is, in my view, more appealing than Hillary Clinton. She's a little easier to listen to. She's very radical left. I've always kind of wished she would run because I want a socialist to run and say, yeah, are we a free country or are we socialist, and make that contrast.
Yeah. Well, and again, you mentioned Beto O'Rourke. Robert Francis O'Rourke, former congressman, ran a fairly effective campaign against Ted Cruz. Do you think he's got a chance for the presidency?
I think he has a chance anyway. He is. Democrats around the country sort of see him as the dream candidate. Tall, thin, somewhat like Barack Obama, talked in platitudes and was able to. I saw a lot of Obama-esque there when I saw him talking. So even though he had said he would not run whether he won or lost the election, I think very few of us thought that would actually be the case. And within a week after the election, he's back there saying, yeah, maybe I'm actually considering it now.
And he met with Barack Obama. And if Barack Obama lays his hand on and says, I think this is the future of the Democrat Party.
Does that help you or hurt you?
Yeah, I don't know. I think Kelly's skeptical.
It's a very different thing to run in a state than it is to run nationally. Everybody was kind of looking at him and casting all their hopes into the empty shell, right? And instead of looking at what does he really stand for? Yeah. That you get into the national election, a lot of this stuff, there's some unseemly stuff in the background, you know.
Oh, yeah.
And not a lot of people knew that in Texas. They still don't know it in Texas. Yeah. They would know it nationally. So it's a totally different story. And you know, the scrutiny is much more in depth. So that I think it would be fascinating to see. I think it would be a lot more difficult probably than he thinks, although there's a lot of money there. $80 million that came in for his campaign.
Right.
Well, we used the piece by Victor Davis Hanson on the perpetual president, but earlier in the week he had one on the one-eyed Jack, and I just got to get nothing else, Debbie Georgatos, to talk a little bit about the Mueller investigation. Then we're also going to talk about the head of the Democratic Party saying, you know, those pesky Christians, they vote on morals. We'll talk about that right after this.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team. Pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
So there's this guy named Jordan. He's a healthy guy. He's a dad of 6, and he works as a guide in Alaska. And he goes to the doctor, true story, he goes to the doctor, and he's diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. And here's the thing. He had switched earlier from medical insurance to MediShare, where Christians share each other's medical bills. So the question for Jordan and his wife, Jenny, was, is this actually going to work?
Our medical bills exceeded $160,000. MediShare members shared all our bills.
And it was about more than just the money, too. This is a real community.
MediShare is a family, a group of people that stick with you through the hardest times of your life. I just don't know how I could have done it without MediShare.
It's so worth looking into. There's a reason this is growing so fast. So if you want to find out more, here is a number for you. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We have, of course, our weekend edition, a roundtable of Debbie Georgatos, as well as Dr. Merrill Matthews and Kelly Shackelford. And in just a few minutes, I want to talk about the Mueller investigation, which is one of the articles we posted earlier in the week, and then also one we posted today about the DNC chair, who is not real happy with Christians who apparently vote according to their morals. Shock of shocks. But just before we get into some of those specifics, I always get people saying, what do you think about this latest nominee? So I thought I'd come to you, Dr. Matthews, for just a minute. And Heather Nauert is going to be, it looks like, the next UN ambassador. Mm-hmm. You've worked with her and have known her for some time.
Yeah,
so tell me more about Heather.
It has been a while. It was back in the mid-'90s, and she was a recent college graduate and decided to get involved in health policy issues. Her father was in health insurance. So she moved to Washington and started started working on that issue. We've got, I was with the National Center for Policy Analysis. We shared the same offices. We oftentimes went up to the Hill together to talk to senators.
She was able to get a lot of appointments for you. I remember that story.
She was a very smart, attractive girl who was still new on health policy stuff. So we ended up doing a lot of things up there. And Fox was just expanding. Fox News was just expanding then. I remember coming back in a cab with her, and she said she had just been on Fox News commenting, and Roger Ailes had just called her and said, hey, I want you to be one of our commentators up there. So she got involved in that and went on to do more on in the media, and then was at Fox for a good while, and then went to the State Department to be the State Department spokesperson. And did, I thought just the times I heard it seemed to do a very good job there. Right. And she got moved up to being a Deputy Assistant Secretary on some kind of issue now, and now she is slated to be the UN ambassador.
So again, I just wanted you to know a little bit of that backstory. I know we haven't told all of it. It was really kind of a fun story that you worked with her. And let's, if we can, put one other name that everybody is hearing about, Kelly Shackelford, William Barr. Now, there is an individual that has had quite a career and was one of the youngest, if not the youngest, Attorney General at one time. Tell the story.
Well, the story is you've got a guy who started out, graduating from college and then going into, I think he grew up in New York, went to Columbia, and then went into the CIA.
Right.
And then decided to take night law school at George Washington while he was in D.C., became a lawyer, and then worked for a number of years, and then was actually went into the government in, I don't know how to describe this to people out there, but I'm pretty sure it was OLC, which is in the Department of Justice. There's sort of a part of it that's sort of the leading intellectuals within the Justice Department.
Kind of like a think tank almost.
Yeah, and so they're very, very bright.
Yeah.
And he was the head person in that. There's OLP and OLC, and I'm pretty sure it was OOC, but anyway, either one of them, very, very, very high, respectable. And then he moved over under President Bush to the Deputy Attorney General. And then you had, at the time, Thornburg, who was the Attorney General, leave and run for office. When they did, he became the interim Attorney General, kind of like we have an interim right now. Mm-hmm. And a crisis somewhat occurred, and he handled it so well that Bush, and I'm going to guess because of his CIA background also, which Bush had, he probably thought, well, this guy's got a great variety background. He really handled the situation. So at age 41, he became Attorney General of the United States. And after that, nobody's really heard a lot, right? I mean, he went and did some things. He's now at, he was of counsel, or I guess he still is right now, at one of the most prestigious law firms in the country, Kirkland and Ellis, and which I have some great people I know there. And evidently he's going to be the new attorney general. My guess is that and I've got to think, if I'm Trump, I want somebody who's strong, who's willing to do tough things if they have to, because that place needs to be cleaned up. The politics and down, I think we're fine. We got great people in the Department of Justice and in the FBI and everything. It's the top political positions that have been totally
political being the operative word.
And so to have a guy who's already been attorney general,
that's going to be good.
Who's now 68? I mean, he doesn't need anything. He's already got the attorney general thing, right? So he's like he's a guy you can bring in, and plus he grew up in New York, right? So I can see Trump liking a kind of guy who knows what he's doing, been around the block, not needing to prove anything, and ready to make a mark. And there are a number of other things we could talk about, but I think that's the main thing is this person going to be strong? Are they willing to clean things up and do the right thing? And do they care about, the attacks and things that maybe you're going to come to try to dissuade them?
Yeah, man. I know Debbie has a list. So, Debbie, give us the list here.
I do. On this Barr, we were just talking about Mr. Barr being nominated to be the Attorney General. He has been critical in the past of Robert Mueller for hiring all Democrats. This is all of the team that Mueller has hired underneath him, Special Counsel Mueller has hired to participate in the investigation / witch hunt, whatever you want to call it, against President Trump and this allegation about Trump-Russia collusion. The entire team is Democrats of lawyers. That by itself just screams bias, in my opinion. He supported Bush 43 relating to his treatment of enemy combatants. That was a big thing, whether Bush 43 should have been engaging in the kind of, or the administration should have permitted the kind of questioning. So he also defended any president's right to terminate federal employees at will. This is such basic Constitution 101. Of course, it's like being the president of a company and being told you can't fire someone who works for you. He is a CEO. President Trump is a CEO of the executive branch, and that it used to be just assumed, but he's been criticized, of course, for that. So this gentleman, Barr, also defended the president's right to terminate federal employees at will. He has said that Uranium One should be investigated, the Hillary Clinton deal, where essentially at her time in the State Department, she ended up participating in the decision to permit whatever it is, 20% of America's uranium assets to be transferred to Russia, uranium being the central ingredient in... nuclear weapons. So anyway, this was Hillary as Secretary of State. So he's saying there were things amiss here. He's willing to speak about investigating those things. So all that I have to say, if President Trump is looking for someone who might be tougher, the last thing I hope that he will do, I think when any new administration comes along, especially when you change parties, it went to Republican control of the government, many heads of agencies will say, I want the top 10%, the top whatever layer it is, tender your resignation, and then I'll let you know if you can stay. That clean out did not happen at the Department of Justice or at the FBI at the time President Trump took over, and it should happen now. I think when the new year comes along, you get Barr in, I think he's got to clean out the higher levels and decide who is not, you don't have to have everyone there who's just a Trump supporter and advocate, but you have to have people committed to the rule of law and who recognize how crazy what happened that Mueller's now investigating. Kind of the end of the story, the beginning of the story was happening before the Trump presidency nomination was even won, which was beginning back in the Obama era, and the misuse of the NSA database by Department of Justice and FBI to attack political enemies of the president. That was the beginning, and that, I hope, gets cleaned out.
Well, we will come back from the break, and I suspect everybody around the round table has some comment about the Mueller investigation. Of course, there are all sorts of books coming out. The Russian Hoax by Greg Jarrett, Dan Bongino. A lot of people have been talking about it. We don't as much simply because everybody on a lot of the other talk radio shows are, but we will spend a minute talking about that or so. And then do want to talk about that DNC chair that's just not happy with all these Christians voting their morals. So we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today is December 7th, a day that President Roosevelt said would be a date which would live in infamy. On that fateful morning of December 7th, 1941, America was attacked without warning. More than 2,400 Americans died and 1,100 were wounded. Our country was changed forever. This attack led us into war, and the citizens of America responded with courage and resolve. So it may be well to reflect on what took place and how we today must also rise to the occasion of an attack on America more than a decade ago. Today is known as National Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day. It is a day when we honor the lives lost in that attack on Pearl Harbor and also honor the veterans of World War II. But it can also be a day in which we also pay tribute to the men and women who are currently serving in the armed forces in an effort to promote freedom and justice around the world. If you travel to Hawaii, you need to stop at the memorial in Pearl Harbor. The USS Arizona stands as a testimony to the 1,177 crew members who died as a result of the attack on December 7th. I understand that more than 40 million visitors have visited that memorial and have therefore honored their heroic efforts of the sailors and Marines. If you've been there, you know that it has become a sacred place as well as a reminder of what can happen when others, either a nation or terrorists, attack this nation. In 1941, the enemies of the United States were Japan and Germany. Today, they're our friends, but we have new enemies, terrorists who want to destroy us and destroy our way of life. We are protected from their evil intentions by those who serve in uniform. So today, take a moment to reflect on your freedom that was bought with a price, and honor those who died for your freedoms and honor those who protect you today. December 7th is an important day, and I didn't want it to pass without challenging you to consider its importance. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if we would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We haven't been very good at taking phone calls, but when we got these guests around the table, we certainly want to hear from them. But the Mueller investigation, I know you can wax eloquent on this, Debbie Georgatos, so I'll force you to try to say it in a few sentences or a couple of paragraphs. But this is an illustration of what happens when an independent counsel is given free rein, and it can go anywhere, or in this case, essentially nowhere. Talk about that.
Did you say just a few sentences?
I know,
okay,
this may never happen.
That's very hard. But I will urge your listeners to just Google and look up Dan Bongino, Bongino. His new book is Spygate. And he is a former...
Greg Jarrett, the Russian collusion. Yeah. A Russian hoax, I should say. Yeah.
But this is
these books.
What Bongino runs through, essentially, which is really answering your question, Kerby, is he runs through that the story that America became aware of this allegation of Trump-Russia collusion, and that led to the appointment of Special Counsel Mueller and looking into, can he prove Trump-Russia collusion? He's saying that was step 2 along the path, and step 1 goes back to during the Obama era when he was still president and he's still in charge of the NSA and the FBI and the DOJ, using the NSA database and querying, looking into the database to gather evidence, information about anyone they view as a political enemy. And the NSA database is being harassed and attacked by the Obama administration and leftists to get information about their political enemies. And then, only because the head of the NSA, Mike Rogers, became aware of it, he went and he complained to the FISA court he said, you have to see what these people are doing. And then he went to Trump and Trump Tower and said they are spying on you. Trump moved out of Trump Tower. The next day, Obama fired Mike Rogers the next day. That was phase one. So what happened was there was abundant evidence of the misuse of the NSA database. So then you get into Mueller and get into the whole Trump-Russia collusion allegation with the notion basically of arguing that they had to begin using the database. They had to do an investigation because it was alleged wrongdoing by Trump, including with the Russians, to win the election. But that was really just to cover up and give more legitimacy to the idea of using information against them. And then the third phase was, so where we're at now is Mueller's going to come up with. But to your point about Mueller, he was asked to look into Trump-Russia collusion. What he's done so far is spent something in the range, I think, is $26 million by now. And he has prosecuted people for things that did occur, people had some connection to the Trump administration or Trump campaign. Nothing of what he has uncovered has anything at all to do with whether the Trump campaign colluded with the Russians to win the 2016 election. Nothing proves that. They're wrongdoing. And I'm not saying these people weren't wrong, but people have prosecuted Papadopoulos. I mean, there's even a fair amount of evidence that a lot of the interaction that Papadopoulos had, that Carter Page had, was set in play by the FBI trying to set them up, so then they got forced into. So where we are right now is we spent a lot of money. There's no evidence of collusion. There has been a shadow over the Trump administration since its inception. Mueller has continued to try to dig to prove something that is not just criminal wrongdoing, but somehow connected to collusion, and has not come up with anything. And it really does have the feel, when you understand the background that Dan Bongino is laying out, it really is just it is the absolute manipulation, the weaponization of the federal or law enforcement agencies by one party to attack another. And this is why people call it, including I will call it, the most serious scandal in American history. Cannot let just exhaustion with it say, okay, we'll let it all go. And actually, in the same time Mueller's doing all this, what Hillary did, the actual conduct of the Uranium One deal, the actual her apparently doing pay to play as Secretary of State, her utter abandonment of protocol and principles related to protecting secure emails, all of that is ignored in the time that we're digging in to find nothing on the Trump administration.
Well, we have a new attorney general, so we'll see where that goes. Any comments?
I think Mark Meadows says he has a stash of emails from the Clinton Foundation now that were given to him, where he alludes to things which we were sort of suggesting as there might be money going into the Clinton Foundation in order to sort of pay for access and other things, at least not now, for future access. With regard to the Mueller investigation, I will only say, under the heading of Republicans seem incapable of ever learning any lesson, 8 months or a year ago, you had a couple of major Republicans saying this special investigator has gone so far off the rails that we need a special investigator to investigate the special investigation. And I thought, are you not learning anything?
So what should they do about it, though?
I would come closer to saying let it. I mean, you should have never started it, but having started it, I think you almost have to let it end. But you could cut his budget or some other thing and try to move the process forward. But then having a good attorney general in there to bring that out would be very helpful.
Could I jump in with the thing? Yes, I totally agree. There was a suggestion by Sidney Powell, who's the author of License to Lie. She's been on the show, I think. She's been on the show and I hosted, I think. Anyway, she made a suggestion half a year ago that we need, whether it's within the Department of Justice or it is appointed especially by the Congress, we need a panel to look into prosecutorial abuse of their discretion, with the notion that not only when they go way beyond their job, when they essentially, Mueller is just digging people out to, and he does this perjury trap thing, which is another reason I think he's just behaved in a manner inconsistent with his responsibilities as a prosecutor, as a lawyer. But Sidney Powell saying, get a special panel put together that investigates prosecutorial discretion and when indiscretion, and when you can find true wrongdoing, disbar them. That would be a great solution. Mueller needs that kind of scrutiny.
Look, until, I don't know what they know. So it's hard to comment on things. I mean, is there any evidence of anything by anybody? I don't know. I want to wait and see it. I actually care about the evidence. But I do know. The thing that's been really disappointing and I think very damaging and dangerous about all this is what this is doing to the rule of law.
Yes.
The rule of law is people don't understand that's what separates us from a banana republic is we actually respect and voluntarily follow the law. This is moving us towards if I don't like who's elected president, I take up arms or I refuse to move out of office. No, you don't have the office now. I'm keeping the office. Why do I say that? Well, because he's violated all these principles of rule of law. I mean, number one, he should never be leading this investigation. He has conflicts of interest.
Yes, he does.
Okay? I mean, Comey alone. Okay? Rod Rosenstein should not be involved in this. He has massive conflicts of interest. The irony of all ironies is that Jeff Sessions, as Attorney General, was told by the Ethics Office that he needs to recuse himself when his conflicts of interest are nowhere near the universe of the guy who's leading the probe and the guy who's in charge of him. So that's bad. Then he appoints as all of his minions Democrat, really some bad people that are running this thing. And the others who all gave money to Hillary Clinton, one of which was the attorney for the Clinton Foundation. I mean, this is who you pick for your neutral team. So this is just real. I mean, all the messages this sends is that the rule of law is fake. It's a joke. But I'll tell you one thing that this has done. You always hear obviously very genuine complaints from the African American community about the abuse of justice.
Right.
And I don't live in those high crime. I've never lived in the high crime communities to see that abuse. But I feel like I'm watching it now. I don't know all the facts, but if what they say about Flynn is true and that basically you had Mueller say, well, we're going to go after your son if you don't, do everything we tell you here and sort of plead guilty and all this, the kind of abuse we've been seeing by these people on his team and that obviously he's ultimately responsible for, I think that's uniting a lot of Americans with African Americans in this country who say this is the type of thing, this sort of prosecutorial abuse is being done in their communities where innocent people are being convicted. I think all that together is really bad for the rule of law now unless we do something about it. But this has been very unseemly. It's been at the very top. They've been violating all the principles. And fortunately, the great thing about this is when all this is done, this is all going to be out in the open.
Yes.
And
transparency.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and we need some serious disinfectant with this situation.
One more thing I might just add is there is an article that came out today in CNN, and that means it must be true, that it's called The Frantic Scramble Before Mueller Got the Job. And that is, some of this was set in place even before there was a special counsel. So it's kind of an interesting thing that CNN came out with as well. But we need to take a break, and when we come back, if you'd like to comment on that, 1-800-351-1212. But I've been postponing, I think, some of the most interesting conversation to the last. The head of the Democratic National Committee, none too happy with Christians because they're voting their morals. Who would have guessed? We'll come right back and talk about that right after this.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. pointofview.net/team. pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
So there's this guy named Jordan. He's a healthy guy. He's a dad of 6, and he works as a guide in Alaska. And he goes to the doctor, true story, he goes to the doctor, and he's diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. And here's the thing. He had switched earlier from medical insurance to Medishare, where Christians share each other's medical bills. So the question for Jordan and his wife, Jenny, was, is this actually going to work?
Our medical bills exceeded $160,000. Medishare members shared all our bills.
And it was about more than just the money, too. This is a real community.
Medishare is a family, a group of people that stick with you through the hardest times of your life. I just don't know how I could have done it without Medishare.
It's so worth looking into. There's a reason this is growing so fast. So if you want to find out more, here is a number for you. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, it is our weekend edition. And again, we have Buddy Matthews and Debbie Georgatos and Kelly Shackelford. And let me go to at least one phone call here in North Carolina. Jay, thank you for joining us today. I think you had some comments about the Mueller investigation. We just talked about that. So what would be your point of view today?
All right, first of all, can you hear me okay?
We sure can.
Great. So I just heard what he was making about these accusations about Mueller and Rosenstein, and it was making you guys made it seem like we had all the information. We don't know what's going on. We don't have the information. We don't know what is actually coming through on the investigation portion. We get little bits of pieces here and there, but we don't know. So until we make these innuendos or these ideas or these perceptions or we think maybe on there, shouldn't we wait until we have all the information before we start saying it, roll it aside, roll it, and the entire investigation has already been swayed and already wrong?
Well, and again, I think Kelly did a good job of saying, look, I don't know what's on the investigation, but we are talking about how some of this developed. So
that's exactly what I said, which is we don't know what until we look at the evidence, what actually, evidence there is, whether he may do anything wrong. But we do know ahead of time already, we don't need anything, that this whole thing violates all kinds of legal ethics and legal principles in the way it's being done.
Good point.
You don't have the person leading in the investigation being a close friend of the people being investigated. You've got Comey and Mueller who were close together, and yet Comey is in the middle of this, having violated federal laws. You don't have Rosenstein being in charge of Mueller and the investigation when Rosenstein is the one who wrote a letter to the president saying you should get rid of Comey. And part of the investigation is, well, is that some sort of violation of the law to get rid of Comey? I mean, this is the kind of thing that you don't do in the United States of America. I mean, it's just incredibly violative of conflicts of interest. So that's what we're talking about, rule of law. And then if you're putting a team together and you're Mueller, you don't have a team that's all from one political side. There's plenty of prosecutors out there that you can get that are experienced, that you can get that are either apolitical or a mixture of people with Democrat or Republican leanings. And so the whole way this thing has been done is horrible, and it sends a message to the public that you can't trust what comes out. That's the problem, is all the violations of ethics rules and conflicts of interest that occur before you even get to what the evidence is.
As far as we know, the results may actually be fine. I mean, they may be very well done. You just don't know. It's just going into it, you're not sure. And Jay, if you were standing before a judge and you knew that judge had a relationship with the person on the other side, you might not. The judge might come down with a very good ruling, but you don't know that going through this, and you feel like, wait a minute, you've got this relationship over there. How am I sure I'm going to get a really fair hearing in this? And I think that's all we're raising.
Actually, I will chime in three more points. I love your point about rule of law. Both everyone's saying that rule of law matters so much. One is the very appointment of Mueller as special counsel directly violated the Department of Justice's own regulations that said you have to have an underlying crime. If there was never crime identified, and therefore the investigation is not even premised on following. Mueller's not serving as special prosecutor under the same way, for example, in previous administrations, a prosecutor appointed under a federal law in Congress. He's a special prosecutor under DOJ regulations, which require a crime which was not alleged at the time. Collusion isn't a crime. I could collude to, surprise Kerby Anderson on his birthday or something. I mean, you can collude to do things that aren't crimes. And so there was no underlying crime to start with. I think that was one huge point. And then if you're wanting very much to have the American public have faith in the justice system, you would, as you're suggesting, have a broad range of people, of lawyers on the team on both sides. And I'll say the third, I'm standing by what I said. I think there is you can put blinders on and ignore things, but I think the simple reality in this, as this has been ongoing since Mueller was appointed, is there have been leaks to the press that only seem to help the prosecution, endless leaks by apparently things that only the prosecutor, that Mueller and his team would have, end up in the media. There has been the use of the perjury trap tactic. We talked about Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. Even the people in the Mueller team investigating and questioning him said they didn't think he was lying. They thought he recounted some conversation. It appeared it wasn't quite accurate based on a secret recording they made, which was only made by abusing the FISA court process to start with. And so you had this recording of Mueller, of Lieutenant General Flynn. He's giving an answer, and even the people questioning him told Mueller, we don't think he's lying, but they still not only prosecuted him, threatened his son and his wife, and so he ends up pleading guilty to something because he's been set up in a perjury trap. When you engage in conduct like that, and Mueller has done this in his career over and over and over and over and over. You don't have to put blinders on and pretend that somehow you don't know this about him and his character. The conduct of this investigation has not been about trying to figure out, has not been limited to the original point of was there collusion with the Russians. It has expanded into, can I find some business deal that somebody did, Manafort did with somebody 8 years ago, and somebody from Ukraine, and so was involved. No connection to the team, but eventually try and put Manafort in the position, put the squeeze on him, twist his arm, maybe he'll turn on Trump. Even searching his own attorney, Michael Cohen's office, you can't look at all of the bad conduct engaged in by the Mueller prosecution or persecution, whatever you want, and say, oh, we just have to be Pollyanna about this and assume somehow that it's all in good faith. You don't have to ignore reality.
Yeah. I think we're all ready for the report to come out, and then we'll be able to have that. But again, we're talking about process, not final pronouncements that come down. And anybody have any idea when that's going to come out? I mean, there were some Democrats that were thinking it was going to come out before the election. But,
I sure hope it comes out soon. And I hope we can get this, people can deal with this and move on. And then we've really got to clean up the FBI and the DOJ at the top. I mean, I think if you go down, you've got wonderful people.
Yeah.
But I think this has been so politicized. And I mean, the idea of unmasking people's information, all the kind of things that are horror stories that all actually happened, that's just got to be cleaned up, because some people are so into their partisanship that they don't care. It's like the ends justify any means they want to use, but they would quickly turn when it turned on the other side. So we have got to make sure that this never happens again to anybody. That you should never be able to try to use the FBI and the DOJ for political purposes. That should be something that is highly punished. It's kind of like when Richard Nixon and the IRS. It's very similar to me. We made it a felony to use the IRS to try to go after people politically. And we need to do something very serious for this type of thing being used politically. This should not be going on in this country.
So again, just a couple of issues that we occasionally talk about. We don't talk about it very often because, like you said, we don't have the Mueller report, but we can still talk about the process before we have the pronouncements. Just before we take a break, though, let me put on the table here the head of the Democratic National Committee, Tom Perez, speaking at the Court in Crisis. What's next for progressives after Kavanaugh? Whoa, he was really concerned about that, and also concerned that Christians are getting the news from like talk radio and Fox News, things like that. But more importantly, he just was expressing his concern, Kelly Shackelford, about the fact that these voters are being influenced by the pulpits of America. I know you have some thoughts about this.
Great. I mean, I don't know if I believe that.
Next question.
I wish it were true sometimes.
This is how, I wish we had David Barton on now, right?
We had him on yesterday talking about how 90% of the pastors say that, yes, the Bible does speak to these issues, but 90% of the pastors say, but I never speak about them because those are political issues.
Yeah, and that's, we go back to the founding of the country. That's exactly how this country founded. The pulpits were booming with talking about how the Bible applies to every area of life. And so guess what? No areas of life are off limits. And so there was an election sermon for every election where they talked about these issues. It's exactly what pastors should be doing. The job of the pastor is to bring the Bible to light for it's relevant to everything we're dealing with. And so that's exactly what we need done. And this idea that because politics now takes over an issue that the pastor is now, forbidden from talking about it, and what the Bible says about it is totally backwards. So great. I don't, like you say, I don't think it's happening enough.
Yeah.
And look, God created three institutions: the institution of the family, the institution of the church, and the institution of government. How often do pastors talk about one of the three institutions that God created? And what our responsibilities are and how that works? I think this is something that really needs to be done better throughout our churches across the country.
Well, let's take a break. And, of course, we had David Barton on yesterday, and he talked about that. My recent booklet was on the Patriot Preachers and talked about some of those things. But when we come back, I want to go around the round table and talk about Christian influence And does that make a lot of sense to alienate people that maybe have religious values if you're the head of the Democratic Party? We'll get into that conversation right after this.
As America honors President George H.W. Bush, elected a mere 30 years ago, there's a sense that we are much further removed than that from his time in office. He famously dashed off thousands of thoughtful communications to world leaders and ordinary citizens, not electronically, but via the handwritten note. It was a different century, really a different era. Ted Cruz pointed out in his tribute to the former president that he was the last of the greatest generation to sit in the Oval Office. At age 18, this future president enlisted in the Navy, becoming one of the youngest pilots in the service. In 1944, his plane was hit by Japanese ground fire. He pressed the attack, but ultimately parachuted into the Pacific Ocean. He wondered, why had I been spared, and what did God have for me? Evangelicals praised the faith of his son, George W., but in an article titled George H.W. Bush Helped Lead the GOP Toward Evangelicalism, the Washington Post describes Bush 41's outspoken reliance on God for strength and his increasingly strong articulation of the party's pro-life position. My pastor brought up something I'd never heard before about the former president. In 1992, at a campaign event held at a New Hampshire insurance company, President Bush told employees, "You cannot be president of the United States if you don't have faith. Remember Lincoln going to his knees in times of trial and the Civil War and all that stuff? You can't be." Later, when faced with questions and critiques from atheist groups, the president doubled down on those remarks. He never backed down or equivocated on the idea that faith is essential to the presidency. Historian Gary Scott Smith wrote in his book Faith and the Presidency, From George Washington to George W. Bush, that George H.W. Bush mentioned prayer in 220 speeches, remarks, and proclamations while president, and the Lord was with him. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for just another segment, and wish we had more time, but we are simply coming to the end. Let me just mention in passing, we did talk about David Barton. He was on yesterday. Jim Garlow and David Barton have a new book out called This Precarious Moment, 6 Urgent Steps That Will Save You, Your Family, and Your Country. But one section, Kelly, you were addressing, and that is the survey that was done by David Barton and George Barna, in which they asked pastors, and first of all, they went just to the evangelical pastors. You take all the pastors in America, and you've got 363,000 churches in round numbers, and then you go down just to those who are evangelical pastors. So that's a smaller group, maybe not even 10% sometimes. And then they ask them, do you believe that the Bible addresses these issues, abortion, same-sex marriage, immigration, a variety of other issues, poverty? And almost all of them, more than 90% of them said, yes, we believe the Bible speaks to that. They went back and asked, do you speak on those issues? They couldn't get 10% to say that they do. Now think about some of these are issues like abortion. Just at least once a year could have a Sanctity of Life message on Sanctity of Life Sunday. So first of all, when you have Tom Perez complaining about the pulpits of America addressing these issues, the harsh reality is sometimes the pulpits aren't. But those that are what is causing him the problem, right?
Yeah, and my first comment when I saw that, I immediately flashed in my brain the battle. I think a lot of people probably heard this. I'm sure you could Google it and find it. But on the floor of the Democratic convention when they fought over whether to take God out of their platform. And there
were a lot of boos.
And it was massive boos when they, they were like, they did not want God added back into their platform. And it was just an uproar. And you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm hearing this. I mean, first, I can't believe it's happening. But number two, even if you believe that way, I'm like, do you think this is going to get you votes? To boo God out of the platform on national TV, but that's what happened. So I thought, well, I guess he's being consistent with that memory that I had of the. I don't know if it was the last. I think it was 2 conventions ago.
2 conventions,
I'm not mistaken.
But they did leave it in, didn't they?
No, they took it out, didn't they?
They took it out, but then eventually, when they put it back in and put Israel back in, there were boos when they put it back in,
right.
But there were boos. Yeah.
And they took a vote on it, if I remember right, and it sounded to me like
they lost.
They lost, and they said, I hear this passing.
Exactly right.
No,
it was
yes.
not the same. He didn't hear the same thing I heard.
No,
yeah.
But for our listeners out there that have a faith commitment and they're registered Democrats, you got to say, why is the chairman of my Democratic Party saying that he's really concerned about Christians who vote their morals? I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me.
I agree. And, Kelly, to your point about the Democrat convention, if it's anything like Republican conventions, it is really the most activist, the most strident who tend to want to become delegates, go to conventions, participate, battle about the resolutions, because the average Joe doesn't want to do that. And so I think you are seeing not just the more strident or outspoken people attend conventions, but really the kind of true believers in the party, the ones that really just rock solid. So the Democrat convention, what was really happening was these are the people who are following what the Democrat Party leadership is saying. These are the ones who are the more, and so this move away from following Christian faith on the Democrat side, it's not the everyday Joe Blow voter. It's a lot of Democrats who vote Democrat their whole life because they are, they're sympathetic with the teachers unions, because they like the little guy mindset. I think the Democrat Party didn't used to be so stridently anti-Christian as it is now. So what we're saying, what you're watching is the Democrat Party at that convention. You're watching the move away from the kind of traditional in the American ball field Democrat Party to where we are today, which is a strident anti-Christian mindset that you're hearing out of this guy. And yeah, Democrat voters, if you continue voting because you used to vote that way, you're voting for this mindset.
It's interesting because this morning, listening to public radio, I heard a story of a group that is trying to create an interfaith alliance. So that includes Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others, to try to address the values issue, as they said. But that was to try to bring people to what sort of reading between the lines, to liberal religious values in that. And it just in our discussion, it crossed my mind that there might be some funding behind this, saying, number one, Perez talking about we need to help work with these Christians. But here's another group that we just heard about on the radio today that's forming to do something exactly along those lines, to try to attract Christians and other people of faith to come over to the liberal values.
Yeah, I don't know. We don't have time. There's only 4 minutes left, but there's a lot of, we were talking in the break for our listeners, there's a lot of George Soros funding behind this idea of diminishing the place of the church, the clarity of the church, and what the scriptures mean. And to your point, Dr. Matthews, about what these kind of groups are doing, it is to convince people the way to come to unity, the way to come to understand each other and come together is simply abandon positions that some people don't like or that are offensive. And so abandon your views on marriage and transgenderism and abortion and these controversial things. You find unity by abandoning anything you stand for.
I thought I'd mention one other issue, and that is Tom Perez says that the reason the other side, he'd mean Republicans, have been successful is they elevated the issue of the courts, Kelly Shackelford. And that's one place where I think we would agree, that a lot of people, even if they said, I don't really like the style of Donald Trump, I do get the sense that he said he was going to put originalist judges on the court. And so I will ignore some other things about his personality, his character, maybe even his policy, because I recognize the courts were going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I think the Republicans, the one advantage they have right now is that, you've got the establishment Republicans and the more conservative Republicans. But on judges, they're all united.
Except for Jeff Flake.
Yeah. He's on his way out.
You had to mention it one more time.
He's on his way out. And on the Democratic side, I think we're about to see somewhat of a civil war. I mean, they have, the old line Democrats who more like the Clintons or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this whole socialist.
No, sorry.
Well, they might be corrupt, might not, but they're, this new line is, they're outspoken socialist. And there's this battle, the Bernie, you got Bernie on one side who wants socialism, and then you've got people who are going, that's crazy, that we can't win an election by being socialist.
Yeah.
And so that fight is going to be interesting to watch. On the Republican side, they usually is always a fight between the establishment, and there's not now. So that's a little different. I think the judges is the main reason for that, to be honest.
Do you think we're going to get any more judges confirmed before we run out of time here? Because a lot of people ask me that question. I want to hear your answer.
I think we will before the end of the year. But in other words, McConnell will probably go to the Democrats and say, we're just going to stay in session through, the end of the year and start pushing some people through. And they'll probably come to some sort of agreement. I don't know whether that's 8 or 9 that they don't have a big problem with, or 10 or whatever. It'd be really nice if it was, I think 4 or 16, so they could get to 100 by the end of the year. But so I think maybe some, but I think it would have been 50 if it hadn't been for Senator Flake. And so all those people are now going to have to wait until probably February to March to start moving through next year with the new Senate.
Well, if you said, I want to hear some more, I believe Sunday you're on America Can We Talk, going to continue this conversation, aren't you?
Absolutely. For our listeners, you can go to Facebook Live at America Can We Talk, 6 p.m. Central Time, 6 to 8. We put the whole show out on Facebook Live or some Salem stations in some cities. And we're going to be talking about these topics and many more.
Yeah, IPI.org, FirstLiberty.org, and all those links are there as well. Next week, we've got Jay Warner Wallace on. We're going to be talking about apologetics. Grant Skelton has a new book out, and he's one of our millennials here. Senator Brian Hughes, he was actually in Texas. Senate is going to be with us, and a whole lot of other individuals I don't have time to mention because we certainly have quite a full roundtable as well next Friday as well. So thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all of you for listening in. We didn't get many of those phone calls in, so I promise on Monday we'll give you more of a chance to weigh in with your comments. And I want to thank Andrew and Steve and Stephanie for their help behind the scenes. And I hope you'll have a great weekend. And join us on Monday right here on Point of View.
Protect the health of the nation. Join the Point of View Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team. Pointofview.net/team. Or call 800-347-5151.
So there's this guy named Jordan. He's a healthy guy. He's a dad of 6, and he works as a guide in Alaska. And he goes to the doctor, true story, he goes to the doctor, and he's diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. And here's the thing. He had switched earlier from medical insurance to Medishare, where Christians share each other's medical bills. So the question for Jordan and his wife, Jenny, was, is this actually going to work?
Our medical bills exceeded $160,000. Medishare members shared all our bills.
And it was about more than just the money, too. This is a real community.
Medishare is a family, a group of people that stick with you through the hardest times of your life. I just don't know how I could have done it without Medishare.
It's so worth looking into. There's a reason this is growing so fast. So if you want to find out more, here is a number for you. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information.